So now let's move on to our wartime conferences section, talking about the big three, and they would become quite acclimated with each other during World War II. One of the first meetings that they had was at Casablanca, which takes place in North Africa, and this was the first conference, but only included FDR and Churchill. And in this, they had their decision to invade Sicily, Italy, the soft underbelly of Europe, as we called it before, and then to demand unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. Why is that of note? Mainly because if you do unconditional surrender, what that means is that you are telling them that they have to surrender. They don't have a choice. That's the only thing you will be accepting. You will not kind of concede land to them. No, you are in control of the negotiations. At Tehran, the big three meet for the first time. This is in 1943. This takes place in the Middle East. Tehran, Iran. They agreed to massively invade Europe through France, and that the Soviets would join the invasion of Germany and eventually help with Japan. Under Tehran, they had actually said that they would, I'll actually write this in right now, they said that they would help Japan within 3 months of the conquering of Europe. So let me quickly put that in there. Within 3 months of them conquering Europe, that Russia would help them with Japan. Now, it's kind of interesting because this is one of the first times, obviously, or this is the first time that the big three meet. And the relationship between FDR and Churchill was a pretty good one. The relationship between FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, when you had Stalin in, was a little bit rocky. One of the things that actually bridged the gap was FDR kind of made fun of Churchill to Stalin. And Churchill kind of became like the butt of the jokes to those between those two guys. But Churchill was willing to take it in order to get Stalin to be on their side. Even though he was on our side, there was a sense of mistrust because he was a dictator and he was communistic, and he wasn't necessarily a good dude. But at Tehran, they decided that they were going to massively invade Europe, and then that Russia would help us with Japan within 3 months of Europe ending. The big one, what took place at Yalta, February 1945. This is the most historic of the meetings that the big three had because there was a lot that was talked about and a lot that was created. Now, at Yalta, this was the conference that said that at the end of the war, Germany would be divided into military zones between the victors. In this case, it would end up being the British, the French, the Russians, and the U.S. And Germany would be divided into military zones. And if you're thinking ahead, you're thinking, this is kind of where we get the Berlin Wall. This is the beginning stages of where the Berlin Wall is actually going to end up taking place. Also, they said that free elections had to take place in liberated countries of Eastern Europe, meaning on this side where Russia is at, they had to give free elections, meaning they couldn't charge people. They had to have people have the options of picking the people that they wanted. And even though the Soviets controlled this area, they had to give free elections. Also said that the Soviets would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of the war ending in Europe. And again, that kind of is a follow-up on Tehran. And then it also was the New World Peace Organization would be formed at a conference in San Francisco. This would forever be known as the United Nations, and we still have that today. Now, why is Yalta a big deal? Well, those four policies, but here's what it did. By saying they're giving free elections in liberated countries of Eastern Europe, what ends up happening here is you're basically telling Russia that you are in control of these elections. Obviously, what type of people are they going to create or put into office? Communistic. Overwhelmingly, historians look at the conference at Yalta as the thing that FDR kind of basically gave Eastern Europe to the Russians in order to get their cooperation to help us fight Japan. And so he's giving one thing to get something else. As a result of this, them entering the war against the Japanese with us, we conceded Russia. And this is where a lot of people believe that the Cold War actually began. Because what it did is it gave Russia complete control over Eastern Europe, and we couldn't really do much about that. Number 5, the death of Franklin Roosevelt. His health was getting worse and more noticeable after Yalta. If you ever see a picture of the conference at Yalta, he looked really, really rough. And so anyway, he ended up dying on April 12th, 1945 in Georgia. The news was devastating to the world. This is a guy who had been president for 12 years. This is a guy who had got us through the Depression, guy who had, for the most part, got us through almost all of the World War II. He had a great relationship with Churchill and the British, and a decent relationship with, the Soviet Union, enough where they would assist us. But this was a big deal. And then we had one more conference after this in July of 1945. This is at Potsdam. This is the new big three. This is Stalin, Harry Truman, and the new leader of Britain, last name Attlee. Not too super important, but here's what you do need to know. That these guys demanded Japanese unconditional surrender, and that they would hold war crimes for Nazi leaders at a place called Nuremberg for all of the war crimes that they had committed during the Holocaust, and so they're going to put them up, on trial, and eventually these guys, a lot of them are going to end up being shot or hung as a result of that. So these guys at Potsdam, this is also where they're even going to talk a little bit about how they're going to deal with the Japanese. Now, at this conference, we're not telling them we have the atomic bomb because we don't want the word to get leaked out. But at this point in time, we pretty much tested the bomb and had it ready to go. The legacy of World War II, this is the deadliest war in American history with over 50 million deaths worldwide. Now, that could be part of the Holocaust. That was because of the Russians. They even killed some of their own individuals. Stalin did that at the beginning of the war. We had over 300,000 Americans that lost their lives and over 800,000 that were wounded. So you're talking about 1.1 million casualties of war. When it comes to the American side of things, we were not hit as hard as other countries, mainly because we weren't there long enough. But 300,000 Americans is a lot of Americans. Much of the world was devastated, and although a large debt ensued, America suffered very little in comparison to the European nations and the Asian nations. The UN was a success, with 50 plus nations joining, and America becomes a key player in the evolution and organization of the United Nations, and still is today. The United Nations is a world peace organization, still exists. You have members that are standing members. The British and the U.S. are two of them. I believe Russia and China are also on there. But lots of questions about the post-World War II world. America had emerged as the dominant world power. However, lasting tensions between the U.S. and the Russians would be key issues moving forward. So let's talk quickly about post-war America and the setting. World War II changed the United States from an isolationist country into a military superpower and a leader in the world affairs, especially as we try to take over the United Nations. 15 million American soldiers returning to civilian life faced problems such as finding housing and finding jobs. And many were concerned about the post-war economy. However, many people had saved during the war because they didn't know what was going to happen, and there were very few consumer goods to buy during the war because companies were scaling back and only focusing on war materials. So what this did is this pent up a whole bunch of consumer demand for automobiles and housing, combined with government road building projects, quickly overcame economic uncertainty after the war. And by the 1950s, Americans enjoyed the highest standard of living achieved by any society in history. You might be like, what does that mean? What we're saying is we lived a very good life. We had grocery stores, we had cars, we had heat, we had electricity, we had sewers, we had plumbing. Life was a pretty normal life for us by the 1950s, and no other society had enjoyed that type of standard of living up to this point in time. Letter B, the GI Bill was something that had allowed individuals that were military, GI stands for government issue, and it allowed veterans to kind of get back into the peacetime economy. This gave GIs the ability to continue their education and at the government continue education. Let me fix this again. At the government's expense. These veterans would also receive low-interest loans, government-backed loans to buy homes, farms, and start businesses. They are doing everything they can. This was FDR's idea, doing everything they can to reincorporate soldiers back into society. And you think about this, millions of men and thousands of women were over there fighting and helping out the war effort. And so what this did is this allowed them to kind of get back to some normalcy. By focusing on education and new construction, the government stimulated the post-war economic expansion, and that allowed everybody, as we said before, to kind of get back into society as quick as possible. You could either go to school, you could start a business. Many people actually did go back to school, but some people just did decide to get right back into the workforce and try to live some normalcy from getting back to the war. You lead to the baby boom. That's the younger marriages where people came back from war, age 21, 22, and they started families, 2, 3 kids, and they resulted in 15 million babies entering the U.S. population between 1945 and 1960. Hence, this is called the baby boom generation. This is probably your grandparents or great grandparents, depending on that time period. And these are called the baby boomers. And this is why you guys have heard some people say, okay, boomer. That's where that phrase actually comes from. As the baby boom generation grew up, it affected the nation's social institutions and economic life in the last half of the 20th century. Initially, the baby boom tended to focus on women's attention on raising children and being homemakers, kind of almost going back to the old school mentality. However, by 1960, 1/3 of all married women did work outside the home because cost of living was going up and families needed financial assistance. But when we say that it affected the nation's social institutions and economic life, now think of it like this. You have all these people that are going to end up going to schools, so high school and college become more important and more focused. And then you have businesses that are going to need more workers, and they're going to have more people that are going to create ideas that's going to need more businesses created and eventually more workers. You're going to talk about Social Security that have been passed during the Great Depression. How are they going to affect that? That's going to be a big, large group of people around the same time that are all going to need Social Security. So that's why it's going to have a larger impact in the late, as they get older in the late 1960s. Suburban growth, the high demand for housing after the war, resulted in a construction boom. William Levitt led in the development, and lots of errors here, guys, sorry about that, led in the development of post-war suburbia with his building and promotion of Levittown. 17,000 mass-produced, low-priced family homes near Long Island, New York, and he did trickle some into Pennsylvania and those areas. You could get a low-interest rate on a mortgage that will both be government insured. Government insured and tax deductible. Made the move from the city to suburbia more affordable for families. And so what this did is this created suburbanites, and suburbs and subdivisions. People moved outside the cities and they went into the not in the rural areas, but in the areas connected the two. You and I, most of you guys live in a subdivision. This was created on the idea by William Levitt. William Levitt actually came up with kind of like an assembly line for houses. Think of it like this. He, at its peak, if everything was timed right, could build a house in 2 days. 2 days. And he had a model of 4 different houses that you could choose from, and it was like a big suburbia. If you guys have ever seen the movie The Sandlot, that's kind of like what this was. Kids would all ride their bikes together. They'd go to the park. They'd go to the pool. They would hang out, and that's what this created. The baby boom created this. And in one single generation, the majority of middle-class Americans became suburbanites. For many older cities, the effect of the mass movement was disastrous, such as Detroit, LA, Boston, as the cities grew poorer and more racially divided. They kind of called this, like I said before, the white flight. Many white individuals, Caucasians, would move out to the suburban areas, the suburbs, mainly because that's who William Levitt was really focusing on, trying to get people to move into his houses. He was focusing on white people, and it was becoming a very segregated society as a result of that. And lastly, the Sun Belt. Post-World War II, many Americans became mobile and moved to the warmer climates, particularly Florida and California. This would shift finances and political power to other regions of the country. If you looked at political maps before this, specifically during the elections, Florida hardly had any votes. But at this point in time, the Sun Belt, that area, basically Tennessee and south, more and more people start moving there, and it really does affect a lot of the country and how people are going to vote, how people are going to spend their money. All right, we'll do post-war politics later on.